me. I'd like to start with our land acknowledgement, which we do for all of our official events at San Diego State. For millennia, the Kumeyaay people have been a part of this land. This land has nourished, healed, protected, and embraced them for many generations in a relationship of balance and harmony. As members of the San Diego State University community, we acknowledge this legacy. We promote this balance and harmony. We find inspiration from this land, the land of the Kumeyaay. So thank you so much, Bob, for that wonderful introduction. I'll just share a little bit more about myself. So I am the director of the SDSU Peta Center. I'm also the chair of our Peta Employee Resource Group, and I'm the faculty advisor for several student orgs on campus. Several of them, as you can tell, are related to Asian American. For example, Alpha Phi Gamma and Delta Sigma Psi are our Asian American sororities. And then we just started an Asian American Journalists Association chapter at San Diego State. So that's really exciting. And then I also got wrapped into doing SDSU badminton, even though I have no idea what badminton really is and how to play, but I guess I'm the faculty advisor for that group. I'm also, and I'll be talking a little bit about my work with the Asian American Education Project, but I'm also the director of curriculum there. And it's going to be relevant to my talk today. And I'm president-elect of Phi Beta Delta, which is an international honor society. And I have, like Bob said, I've published over 350 books at the moment. My former experiences include, prior to my role as the Peta Center director, I was the director of liberal studies at San Diego State, which is one of the top 10 majors at the university. I was also in charge of our clinical practices, which is essentially the student teaching, the EdTPA coordinator, which is the performance assessment. I was also the credential program leader and a faculty and teacher education. So I taught a lot of the methodology and the literacy classes, since literacy was definitely my area of expertise. And prior to that, I was a K-8 classroom teacher. So I've taught in Charlottesville, I have taught in Chula Vista, and I've taught in San Diego Unified, or in La Mesa Spring Valley, sorry. So I've been around, and I've got, a lot of my career has been in education in one form or another. So, and that will be relevant in my talk as well. So I will dig into that a little bit as we move forward. Okay, so I wanted to say a little bit about the Peta Resource Center. So we are the newest cultural center on campus. We got established last July, in the middle of a pandemic. And this August, we opened up our physical space on campus. Those of you that have been on campus, we are right above Starbucks. So people tend to not know where we are, but they know where Starbucks is. So we're in the student union. So it's a great space and we're having lots of fun, but it speaks to the importance, especially during this time of anti-Asian hate, of providing our students and our faculty and our staff a space that's their own in our big university. So we have done over 300 programs last year. And so far we have done close to about 80 programs. So keep up with us. Please follow us on our Instagram at SDSU Peta Center, and Facebook if you have that as well. And or we also have a contact list. So keep up with us. Our events are open to the community. It's harder to have community members on campus, but we have a lot of virtual events as well, and those are open to everybody. Okay, so I also want to talk a minute about my work with the Asian American Education Project. So currently I am helping out with their curriculum development, and I had led the team. I don't know if maybe I can get some emoticons up here or some thumbs up. How many of you saw the PBS documentary on Asian Americans? That was fabulous. Yes, I see Michael, you got your thumb up. So I led the team, the team that created the elementary school lessons for that program, and I'm very proud of that work. So, the documentary is amazing for our community, and being able to work on the lesson plans as well, having it hit, schools nationwide has been really, really inspiring. So I'm really proud of that work. So we continue the founders, Stuart and Pat Quo. They were the lead on that grant to do the lesson planning, and they created the Asian American Education Project. And we're going to be continuing to provide professional development and lesson plans for schools across the nation related to Asian American history. So this is also really important and really exciting. And they just started, they're a startup as well, so they just started. Okay, so for today's talk, the agenda will be as follows. I am going to do we're already doing welcome and introductions, and then go into a lecture about Angel Island Paper Sons, the challenges of teaching about Paper Sons, connections to today, and then of course I'm really excited to hear about Russell's experience as well, and then after that we'll be available for Q&A. And I'm seeing in the chat that's Wendy sent me a direct message about, can we define they see? So they see means folks from the South Asian diaspora. So we're referring to Indian background, Bangladeshi, Pakistani. Okay, so who am I? So I kind of like to ground who we are, who I am, to kind of understand why I'm doing this and what brought me to Paper Sun. So my Chinese name is Luo Xin Mei, and it's one of the only things that I know how to write in Chinese. I was a Chinese school dropout, so I only did about 2 years, and I'm very upset about that. I wish now that I, was more adept at my own language. But I was born in the year of the dragon on Flag Day. So I tend to use that as a little fun tidbit to kind of ground my being, myself being Asian American. But yeah, so I was the first person in my family to be born in the United States. And that's why my family named me Virginia, after the state in which I was born. So the family joke is, if I was born anywhere else, like in Massachusetts, etc., my name literally would be Massachusetts, because my parents didn't realize those are not names that you call kids. So luckily I was born in Virginia. And I also went to the University of Virginia. So another big joke is Virginia, from Virginia, who went to the University of Virginia. So those are my roots. I also want to share a little bit about my own family heritage. So my family were ethnically Chinese, and with the Japanese occupation, my family had escaped to Cambodia. And then, so they essentially grew up in Cambodia, and then the Khmer Rouge happened in the 1970s. So then my family had political asylum in the United States. So first they were actually settled in Arkansas, and then somehow they ended up outside of DC, which is, I grew up in Fairfax, Virginia. So that's where I grew up. And so we have, my childhood growing up, I had a lot of mixture of Chinese and Cambodian influences, and that was most evident in the food that my mom cooked. So I, of course, when I was growing up, I didn't realize it was just my mom's cooking. But as I'm getting older and have experienced different foods, I'm realizing she really did blend, the Cambodian, Southeast Asian, and Chinese cooking. So that's my background, and I identify more as being Chinese American, and I'm learning more about, have my Cambodian background as well. So most of the books I've written have to do with being Chinese American, but like I said, I am also actively learning about my Cambodian, Southeast Asian roots as well. Okay, so why Paper Sun? So Paper Sun, I wrote this picture book with Helen Foster James back in, I want to say before 2010, I think. It's been quite some time. And so why did I feel compelled to write Paper Sun? One of the big reasons is because at that time I was teaching 3rd and 4th grade. And so it had to have been over a decade ago. when I wrote it because of the timing. But I remember being in my 4th grade classroom, and I don't know if there are any other elementary school friends out there, but in 4th grade, the curriculum is California history. So that's the social science standard. So you're teaching California history. And I remember when I was teaching it that being Chinese American myself, I was really looking to teach more about Chinese American history. But unfortunately, there wasn't enough materials. And there also, so when I mean materials, I mean, books and teacher guides and training. We do not get this training in your teacher ed programs. You don't learn about Chinese American history. And what was in the textbook, which is usually what teachers teach because it's in the textbook, was extremely limited. There was content about the Transcontinental Railroad, of course. There was maybe one line about the Chinese the Chinese Exclusion Act, but there really wasn't anything about Angel Island. I'm gonna mute Judith Rubinson. There wasn't anything in the curriculum, and there weren't any materials that I could use to teach these lessons that I wanted to teach. The other thing that I want to point out too was I tended to be, if not the only, one of the only Asian American teachers on campus. So when I was teaching Asian American culture and Asian American history, my kids got it. But when I left that campus, because I did teach at several different school sites, and when I left that campus, the Asian American history left with me because no one else was teaching it. So I want to point out two issues that I discovered as I was teaching. One, the lack of curriculum materials around Asian American history, and two, the lack of representation of Asian American teachers in the teaching force. So those are two big issues. If we really care about our students learning about Asian American history, we need to address both those issues. So that inspired me to do several things. One, it inspired me to write a book about Paper Sun so that teachers like me who wanted to teach about this experience had materials. And the other thing that inspired me to do is, work on my doctorate and have this be an area of expertise that I study. So this is where my passion started for this work. Okay. So I set about to do that. And again, like I mentioned, I've got 350 books out there. So I have written quite a bit. I have several books about the Asian American experience. Neon about the Chinese New Year monster. And then I have, a book about Popo's Lucky Chinese New Year. And then I've got, I worked with Cherry Lake Publishing to develop an imprint for high-low readers. So I've got many nonfiction books with that imprint. And several of those books are about, Chinese American history, Asian American history. And I share two books right now that I specifically focus on the Asian American immigration. So I've got Detained and Interrogated about Asian American immigration, and these are readers' theaters, and When the Ground Shook, San Francisco Earthquake of 1906. So I'll be talking about how that created the loophole. And then I do have a new series coming out next year called Racial Justice in America that focuses on Asian American and Pacific Islanders. The titles are where I have books about Yellow, Peril, Model Minority, Perpetual, Foreigner, and also Asian Black Solidarity. So those books will also be out next year. So I care deeply about these issues and making sure that our students across the nation have access to our Asian American history. Okay, Elaine Aoki, she wrote, Asian Pacific American people have been separated from Asia and Pacific by geography, culture, and history for more than 7 generations. We have more than 150 years of history in America, yet where are we in the literature? Are we still foreigners in this white person society? Are we still perceived as whining and apologetic? And I love this quote because, again, it talks about how we have been erased and minimized in the American history narrative, and we need to make sure that we are included. So one of the things that I would do at my author visits is talk about, like, what are some popular Asian Americans? And most of the folks, and these are students, again, they tend to focus on entertainers, pop culture, and athletes. But they don't know historical figures. So for example, I'll ask them that, who is Rosa Parks versus Vincent Chin? Of course, they studied Rosa Parks, not Vincent Chin. What is the board versus the Brown versus Board of Education versus Lau versus Nichols, which was huge for, schools. And then of course, what is Ellis Island versus what is Angel Island? So again, this is a huge gap in our in our education, because students know about Ellis Island, but they do not know about Angel Island. So what is Angel Island? What's the Angel Island immigration station? So first of all, let's talk about where Angel Island is, because this is another point that folks don't know. Where is Angel Island? It's an island in San Francisco Bay. And most people are familiar with, when you go to San Francisco, because almost everybody's been there, they're familiar with going to Alcatraz. And if you go to the ferry, you have two options, Alcatraz or Angel Island. And most people choose Alcatraz. They don't go out to Angel Island. And so, choose, next time you're at San Francisco, choose Angel Island. It's amazing. I don't know how many, if I could get a thumbs up, how many folks have actually been to Angel Island. It is amazing. So I highly recommend that you go. It has a lot of recreational activities, but the immigration station is a tiny bit in this corner, in the top right corner of the island. And the rest, it's actually a really big island. There's lots of stuff going on there, but what we're talking about is going to be happening in this tiny little bit. So that kind of was a big deal to me too, thinking like, oh, you have this notion that the whole island is about the immigration station, but it's not. It's a tiny little bit. So what is the Angel Island immigration station? It was established to solve, quote unquote, the Chinese problem. And I'll talk about what the Chinese problem was in a minute. And it served as an immigration processing center in the early 1900s. It forced Chinese Americans to endure invasive medical exams, long detentions, and intense interrogations. So Chinese Americans were unfairly treated. The immigrants that came over, they were unfairly treated at the immigration station. Ellis Island, most folks just went through. You came in, you got processed, you went through. At at Angel Island, however, the Chinese immigrants were subject to these horrendous conditions in several ways. So first was the medical exam, where they had to strip naked, and a lot of the procedures were invasive. And of course, it was said to be done for public health reasons, but the same wasn't done at Ellis Island. And then they had to suffer long detentions. So folks didn't know if they were going to be there for a week, for 2 weeks, for 5 months, for years, etc. And then they had to go through these intense interrogations. And again, I'll talk about that with the Paper Sun process, but they were questioned for hours and hours and hours on end. And I want to point out that this is all again, unfair, because comparatively speaking, it was not happening at Ellis Island. And also folks were grouped. The Chinese American immigrants, when they came off the boat, they were sorted. So the Chinese immigrants had to go into Angel Island and suffer long detentions, where other immigrants, white Europeans and non-Chinese Asian immigrants, they were processed quickly and then allowed to go onto the mainland. And so this center processed approximately 1 million Asians, 175,000 from China. 60% were refused entry, and it was the highest rejection rate of any ethnic group. So these are pictures from my research trip out to Angel Island. So that's this is the pier when you get on it. And I was tickled to death because I got to be on the tour van that was named Virginia. So that was fun. So we took a tour around the island, and I have more pictures to show you from my trip. So what are the paper sons and daughters? So I'm specifically talking about the paper sons and daughters today, but know that there were other immigrants that arrived that were not paper sons and daughters. So paper sons or paper daughters is a term used to refer to the Chinese people who were born in China and illegally immigrated to the US by purchasing fake papers, which stated that they were blood relatives to Chinese Americans who had already received US citizenship. Typically, it would be relation by being a son or daughter. So essentially what happened was there was a system in which with the Chinese Exclusion Act, Asian immigrants laborers were no longer allowed to come into the country. So then they had to, so they created a system in which those that were already here in the United States said, because they could bring over their relatives, they said that they had relatives back in mainland China and would bring them over. And they would sell these. It was very precious. They would sell these fake documents to, rural families and whoever wanted to have a fake citizenship or fake papers to come over. And then they would practice because you would have to have all this familial knowledge in order to pass the interrogations. So they pretended to be related to the families that lived in the United States in order to come over. Okay, so some fun facts to know. 1 in 3 Chinese Americans today are survivors or descendants of the paper son system. So again, this is just to point out how, the great impact of this. And in order for the numbers to be true, and there was a preference for sons over daughters. So there were more paper sons than daughters. But in order for the numbers to be true, each Chinese woman in San Francisco would have to have given birth to about 600 and 800 boys. So the math did not shake out. So as many paper sons as we had, come over and check off, the math wouldn't have worked out. And also because at that time there were bachelor societies, which means that because of the Page Act, not many Asian women were allowed to come over. So that meant that, men at that time working here weren't really allowed to marry and have families and etc. So there weren't that many women here. So men formed a lot of bachelor societies when they were here. So considering how many Chinese women were here and how many paper sons there were, the math doesn't work out. Paper sons and daughters had coaching papers. So you can see some examples of some coaching papers that they used to prep for the interrogation. So while they were traveling on the boat from China to San Francisco, a lot of these paper son and daughters had to study these interrogation coaching papers. So they would study all these little details, and some questions were, for example, like where's the rice bin, to the left or to the right of the window, and how many windows are in your house. So I don't know about y'all, but I couldn't tell you how many windows are in my house right now. So there were all these very specific questions. Who is the second cousin to your mother? And if you tripped up, and they asked these questions over and over and over again for hours, and if you tripped up, then you could risk being deported. So the coaching papers were extremely important for the immigrants to study. And then before they got into the harbor, you would see, the immigrants toss over the coaching papers into the waters, because they could not have the evidence of it when they were being processed in the station. So they had to memorize, all the information in their coaching papers. Okay, and then paper families. So those are the fake families that lived in the mainland. they paid, for example, to help pass messages to the detainees. Like, for example, and I use this in my story, but for example, they would have kitchen help, because a lot of the kitchen help were Chinese immigrants. They would have kitchen help write messages on orange peels, and then, you know, give that to the detainee during mealtime, so that they would have some new information and be able to share that during the interrogations. So, and I know that Russ is going to talk about this later too. So that's just one example of resistance, and there were, you know, several examples of resistance as well on at the Angel Island immigration station. So again, these are some pictures from my visit there, but this is what the dorms looked like. These were some of the buildings at the detainees had to stay in. And then these are, I mean, I was blown away when I saw this, but this is how they lived. So they were cramped. And what you're not seeing, because of the angle of this, is that on the other side, you could see these bamboo, there's not bamboo, but you could see these steel rods. On the other side, there's another small cot. So imagine it like a butterfly. So it's like you have one person sleeping on one side, and then the other person sleeping on the other side. So these were extremely cramped quarters, and they had to put everything that they owned in this small, tiny space. So these were not, and of course it's, you know, I mean, there were, sickness was rampant. You know, there were a lot of, you know, violence and illnesses, etc., because things spread in such small, cramped quarters, and they received very minimal medical treatment. So it was not, these were not good conditions that these folks had to live in for months, weeks, years. Okay. And then these are, you know, this is a picture of the bathroom. So you could see there was absolutely no privacy, you know, especially for a culture that values privacy. There was no privacy. So, you know, folks were, again, subject to this for, you know, weeks and months and years. Now, one of the stories that I could not write about in terms of, you know, the writing a children's book, but I do want to write about this for adult and older readers. The bathrooms, there were several cases of incidents in which immigrants had, you know, this was a tough life, and they committed suicide. So they committed suicide in the bathrooms, and there was you know, there were reports that showed how like already these conditions are, you know, it's not very, I wouldn't want, you know, the bathrooms are not private, or, you know, there's lots of issues with using these bathrooms. But one of the other issues, oh, and they would overflow a lot, and it just, again, not kept well. But because folks were, there were some incidents of folks having committed suicide in the bathrooms, folks were also fearful of using the bathrooms because of the ghost, right, that would live there and haunt the bathrooms. And, you know, again, this had related deeply to Chinese superstition. But it was, you know, it was just, it was really tough. It was really tough. Okay. So I took this view too, because this is the view that they had. It was a prison. I mean, they called it an immigration station, you know, but it really was, this feels like incarceration. You could see, of course, San Francisco, the mainland, from their windows, but they lived behind barbed views. And, you know, again, so this was, you could see that the outside views gave some folks hope, but it also gave many despair. So the other thing I want to talk about is, and the reason why I talk about the hope and despair is because we have evidence of a lot of their feelings from these wall carvings. So this is one of the most amazing things about the Immigration Center. So again, those of you that have not gone, I highly recommend that you do. It was one of the most amazing trips that I've ever been on. But what struck me were these wall carvings. So immigrants, the detainees, would carve these beautiful Chinese poems in the walls, and they were all over. So when you walk in, they're all over. And, you know, they told their stories. So there are stories about hope and despair, and there are stories about like how, you know, their experience, etc. So we get a lot of, you know, what had happened there from, you know, because folks did keep diaries, etc., but from these wall carvings as well. And of course, we're collecting data from oral histories. But the other reason why I find this significant is because when the immigration center finally shut down, and in fact, it was used, you know, during World War II, you know, as a prisoner of war camp, I believe, for Japanese, etc. So it got shifted and used for different things, but it finally shut down at some point in time, and it was left to be abandoned. Essentially, nothing had happened, and it was left there. But a park ranger, Alexander Weiss, he was a park ranger for Angel Island. And they, at one point in time, there were conversations about demolishing the Angel Island building, but Alexander Weiss saw these wall carvings. And then it became a, you know, a reason to be a historical marker. So these wall carvings saved that building, and we have it today as an active museum. But these, I've always kind of wanted to think about how to turn these wall carvings into a story as well, because it's just, they're just beautiful. So the Paper Sons loophole. So how did we get here? How did this happen? So first of all, we kind of need to understand the context of what was happening at this time. So we had, with the gold rush and the Transcontinental Railroad, there were a lot of Asian laborers, Chinese laborers that came over to make their fortune, because there was also a lot of floods and drought and famine happening in China. So Chinese immigrants wanted to seek their fortunes in what they called the Gold Mountain. So they came over here and built the railroads, got very little credit for it, and they built mining towns that turned into real towns, you know, along the way. And they also, you know, worked on businesses, laundries and restaurants, etc., that serviced the miners, etc. So they built a, you know, the labor, Chinese labor was used and exploited in many ways here. But so it was okay for Chinese laborers to come over and work and, you know, set up white America, but then they were expected to go back to China, but they stayed, many stayed. So this created a sense of yellow peril. And yellow peril is a propaganda. It was, you know, heavily used in posters and newspapers, etc. And it's the notion that Asian people pose a danger to white supremacy and white privilege in terms of economy, public health, national security, etc. And it originated during the late 19th century when Chinese workers were legally immigrated to majority white countries like Australia, Canada, and the US and New Zealand. Asian immigrants exhibited a strong work ethic and were willing to work for lower wages. This created economic insecurity. Instead of blaming the system, Asian people were blamed. So, and it captures the irrational Western xenophobic fears that Asians, especially Japanese, the worldwide threat of Japanese dominating with their military power, would invade or settle in their lands and disrupt white purity and Western values such as democracy, Christianity, etc. And this yellow peril has manifested in different ways over history. So it's manifested in terms of anti-Asian hate, it's manifested in discriminatory laws against Asians, etc. So the one of, again, I want to just point out, one of the main things is a fear of Asians. It's irrational. So again, it created, this yellow peril, anti-Asian hate created policies and laws that were discriminatory against our people. So for example, the 1875 Page Act, which I referred to before, this federal law prohibited the recruitment of laborers from China, Japan, or any Oriental country who were not brought to the US of their own will, or who were brought for lewd and immoral purposes. Specifically, it forbade the importation of women for the processes of prostitution. So the problem of this is that it assumed that especially Chinese women who were coming over were prostitutes. That was the main assumption. In practice, what it did was prevent Chinese women from immigrating to the US, because officials at the port cities, they decided who was a prostitute and who wasn't. There wasn't any real evidence. And Chinese women were automatically assumed to be prostitutes, and Chinese women were subject to humiliating and discriminatory interrogations. And Chinese women they either chose not to come, or they were prohibited from immigrating because of this Page Act. And again, I want to note that there were no laws that targeted immigrant women from European countries. So this helped to build the bachelor societies that I talked about. So again, these were measures that the US put in to prevent more Asian laborers, specifically Chinese folks, from coming over. And then of course, we have the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. So it is the first significant law restricting immigration into the United States. And it is the first, and let's hope it is the only law to impose a quota on a specific racial group. It was passed as a result of yellow peril. So many Americans on the West Coast attributed economic struggle to Chinese workers. They were also concerned about white racial purity. It led to the establishment of the Angel Islands Immigration Station and the Paper Sun system. So essentially, the Paper Sons and daughters were the first illegal immigrants. What is the perpetual foreigner stereotype? This is the notion that Asians are outsiders, that we're always outsiders because of the way we look. So these racist laws and practices positioned Asian Americans as outsiders. They were seen as foreign or other. They were seen as not being able to assimilate. And the idea is that, they don't belong here. And again, it has manifested in various ways with exclusionary, discriminatory laws that I have already shared with you, and there are many more. Those are just the top two that I felt were related to the Paper Sons. It talks about where are you from? When people say, where are you from? Assuming that you're not, again, from here. Comments of go back to where you come from. I got that when I was growing up. Folks would say to me, go back to China. And of course, the worst manifestation of the perpetual foreigner stereotype are hate crimes, which in this past year we have seen. So all these things, all these conditions kind of leads up to like the what was happening at that time, and what some of the things that Asian Americans had to face at that time. Deep prejudice and laws that were extremely discriminatory. So what created the Paper Sun loophole? And that was the San Francisco earthquake of 1906. So this earthquake essentially destroyed San Francisco, and specifically the City Hall area. And City Hall burned down, and along with that were all the records. So they didn't have and back then, obviously, they didn't have computers. So there was no cloud saving this information. So all the birth records, et cetera, were destroyed. So this is how Chinese living in America, they would go claim, because again, in the process of, rebuilding, they had to also rebuild these records. So in the process of doing this, the folks that, the Chinese Americans that were living in the United States at this time, they would use this as an opportunity to claim that they have these relatives. So the sons and daughters. So on paper, and that's why it's called Paper Sons and Daughters, because on paper, they had this son that lived in China. They had this daughter that lived in China. So they created these paper documents on file, on record. And then they would use them, they'd have a broker and they would sell these paper sons and paper daughters to folks in China that wanted to immigrate. And so that's how that process came about, because of the earthquake. And again, I see this as a form of resistance and resilience to fight against an oppressive system. But technically it's also illegal immigration. But again, and I'm going to let Russell talk about the examples of resistance. But I see this as a form of resistance to fight these unfair laws that discriminated specifically against the Chinese. So what are the challenges of teaching about paper sons? And I know that I'm really excited about what Russell's going to say too, as you can tell, but I know that Russell's going to talk about his own family history as well. But so why is it hard to teach about paper sons? First, it's the lack of teacher knowledge, like I shared, about Asian American history. So the Asian American history that I got in schools was really limited. And I had to learn a lot when I was a teacher because I wanted to teach it. But we still do not teach about Asian American history. So we need to have some advocacy around there. So I highly urge folks to support ethnic studies. There's legislation about ethnic studies in K-12, and I highly support that folks support that, because we need to have our history be taught in schools. It's also tied to conversations about undocumented and illegal citizenship, and folks are uncomfortable talking about that, and because it's very political. There's also complicated perspectives regarding racism, public health, etc. There's conversations about, well, did the United States do that because of public health? Were there reasons or justifications for why that that processing was necessary, etc. And then of course there's silent stories, and this is where I'm really interested to hear about Russell's history, because we know that this is a topic that isn't really talked about. Just like with Japanese, folks that were in the Japanese incarceration, they didn't talk much about their experiences. Being a paper son and paper daughter was also not talked about. So it's a silent story. We are getting more and more oral histories, and more people are sharing, especially as generations are here. But, folks were still very much scared of being deported. And of having this history, so it was not talked about openly, and we need to be able to talk about these issues in order for us to come to any form of truth and reconciliation process. So our history needs to be a part of the American narrative. We need to be a part of our country's cultural literacy. So the connections to today, like essentially, why is it important to learn about the paper sons? Why is it important to know this, to tell the stories, to continue to talk about it? Because it's one of many examples of anti-Asian hate. Again, there's so many, I'm just kind of pointing out the big ones, but the Chinese Massacre of 1871, which historically is one of the largest mass lynchings in our US history, yet we don't hear about it, we don't talk about it. Japanese incarceration, the Vietnamese shrimpers and the KKK in the 1900s, where the KKK burned down their boats and communities. And there were stories, especially in mining towns, where the Chinese were chased out of these towns and put on trains or massacred, etc. The murder of Vincent in 1982, that's probably one of the most popular ones here, but I'm gonna say that not many people know of any of these. The Stockton schoolyard shooting in 1989, in which Vietnamese and Cambodian and Southeast Asian students were killed in this shooting. And again, this was a mass shooting that happened at an elementary school, and we don't hear about it. The murder of Joseph Aledo, a Filipino-American postal worker who was shot. And then of course, 9/11 and Islamophobia that saw a lot of they see American friends like discriminated against for looking like the terrorist of 9/11. Um, and then we live in our moment of current anti-Asian hate that's brought to us by comments such as the Kung flu comments that Trump made about Kung flu and coronavirus, China virus, etc. We have seen an increase of anti-Asian hate, and this is reported by Stop AAPI Hate. Me and a couple of other SDSU professors wrote an op-ed in the Union Tribune about the Atlanta shooting when that happened, because I felt that very deeply. Those women look like me. And so we're feeling it. Anti-Asian hate is an American tradition and is centered around two main stereotypes: the perpetual foreigner and the model minority. These are the major roles that the Peta folks have been positioned to play in US history. Laborers, like the Chinese immigrants that come over, who are expected to go back home; scapegoats, who were blamed for national insecurity, for economic insecurity and public health insecurity; and the model minority, who are used to diminish other groups and distract Black, Indigenous, and people of color folks from joining with us, joining forces, so that we can dismantle white supremacy. And of course, connection today too, it's also the paper sons and daughters phenomenon is also related to undocumented. And we have a lot of political issues around what it means to be undocumented today. So one of the things that I like to say at all of our presentations at the Peta Center is that we need to stop Asian hate. And in order to do that, we need to celebrate a Peta joy, amplify a Peta voices, promote a Peta creativity, support a Peta businesses, nurture a Peta minds, and love a Peta people. So please stay connected with us. We have Instagram, Facebook, and our contact list. And support us if you can. And here's my contact for anybody that would like to contact me. I'll also put it in the chat. And then, yeah, and that is it. So I'm looking forward to hearing more from Russell, and then we'll be available for the Q&A. So I guess I'm gonna say back to you, Bob.
Well, thank you very much, Virginia. We loved your presentation. And I just thought it was actually wonderful and to the point. I thought Lily Cheng asked me to mention a word or two about Ellis Island. And so I thought I would mention that. I also want to point out, Virginia, why you're in the United States, which you didn't mention. You're in the United States because the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act got reversed in 1943 because the Chinese were our allies in World War II, but that did not do it. That was irrelevant, actually, because in 1924, we passed this awful tribalist Immigration Act, which excluded everybody. And one of the congressmen who voted against that act, but it was outvoted, was Emanuel Seller, a young man from New York. And he said, if I live long enough, and if times change, I'm going to create a law, and I'm going to pass a law that's going to reverse this. And in 1965, Emanuel Seller wrote a law that was signed by Lyndon Johnson, the Immigration Act of 1965, on October 3rd, which resulted in opening the doors to people from all around the world. So if you know people from China or Cambodia or India or Pakistan, they're all here because of the 1965 China Exclusion Act. My grandfather came to the United States in 1905, before the 1924 Act. If it was after 1924, he wouldn't have come. And he came after pogroms in the Ukraine, and similar stories with that's the same year that Tevye der Milchig, or Tevye the Milkman from Shlomo Aleichem's story, which became Fiddler on the Roof, came to the United States. And he moved to Philadelphia, and my mom was born in Philadelphia in 1907, and here I am in Escondido. So there are these universal elements to immigration, and we loved your talk. And at this point, I'm going to ask Russ to have a slide presentation of his own multi-generational family. Russ, take it away.
Thank you so much, Bob. It's always my pleasure to speak with you. And you are certainly one of my favorite moderators. So in Virginia, that was an absolute fabulous talk. It's wonderful. And I hope I can add something to it with perhaps a personal perspective of what Angel Island was and what it is and why it's still important today. You know, ultimately, Angel Island is not a geographic location. It's not a building. It's a human story. It's a story of anti-Chinese legislation and how that affected America and all Asians, certainly. This is a picture we've all seen many times. And I just realized that my grandmother sat on these very benches. It's really quite compelling to realize that she was in this detention center. And as Virginia pointed out, it was much worse than that. It was really a prison for these women. But the truth is, it didn't start here. Angel Island was one component of one time period. But remember that the Chinese Exclusion Act began 28 years early in 1882. So anti-Chinese legislation and its effects on all of us really predate this image in Angel Island by a long time. And many of you know that I wrote this book, Three Coins. It's about these young women who came as survivors of human trafficking. And these women in this photograph, sitting in front of what is now the Cameron House, are here because of the Exclusion Act. The ratio of Chinese men to women at this point in the 1800s was 20-1. So it was natural, quite frankly, unfortunately, that human trafficking, prostitution, and domestic slavery resulted directly from that. And we're still feeling the effects of that to this very day. My great-grandmother's here. This young girl here you're going to meet in just a little bit. She actually is quite famous. This one here, I believe, her daughter was the first Chinese-American women physician in this country. So while we look at these women as survivors of human trafficking, they actually were quite courageous and resilient. And as I often say, they became the foundation of early Chinese-American society in the 1800s and early 1900s. The ripples continue, and this is another book I'll mention to you briefly that I wrote. It's coming out in February. And the ripples and the effects of the Chinese Exclusion Act continued far beyond that. This is the grandchildren of some of those women. It's actually the World War II generation. This is Stanley and his brother Lauren are going to be in this war. And these young men are going off to fight and to die and to protect their freedoms for a nation that was still excluding them. In fact, one of the young men here died before the Exclusion Act was actually repealed in December of 1943. So this book is a human story. But it's not only about Chinese, and it talks about how the Chinese integrated into these fighting units, and they became part of really the all-American crew is what I like to call it. So I hope that you'll be able to come back and talk to you about that, because I said it's a ripple of the Exclusion Act and of these young women who started out on those steps on Sacramento Street in 1882. Now, one of the things that the Exclusion Act did, which really wonderfully benefits all of us who like to research and find family history, is it preserves these incredible files. This young woman here is Xing Yi. She actually was in Three Coins. She is the young woman who befriended my great-grandmother Ying as they're coming to the boat. They're both, and she's 9, and Xing Yi here is probably a few years older. So she's part of the story, and her family actually went back and forth. So there are these wonderful records that were preserved and are now at the National Archives. You can see here, this one actually is during the Exclusion Act. But she and her family continued, and they went back to China for the very first time in 1901. Remember, the Angel Island doesn't come into play until 1910, but the Exclusion Act and its effects and these interviews and this discrimination preceded that by many, many decades. But these wonderful records show what this family looked like. No one in this Jin family had ever seen these photographs. This is one of the boys here who married one of Ying's daughters, and it shows wonderful stories. If you can get your hands on these verbatim transcripts of these interviews, these interrogations as we call them, they are golden. I often say that if I could just sit down with my great-grandparent for 5 minutes, I would know so much more than everything I've discovered in the last 3 decades. Well, basically, these transcripts allow you to do that. You get into their minds, you hear their voice, you hear what they're saying, they're describing not only the family, but where they came from. But you can also see the loopholes and the lies. So this was in 1919. She is Xing Yi, the young woman who came over with my great-grandmother, is claiming that she was born on DuPont Street in San Francisco in 1868, and she was born in a particular building called the Spanish Building. Well, that wasn't true. I didn't know it at the time. I told the family. I was quite excited, and they said, that's absolute nonsense. But not only did she say it, but she got white people to confirm it. There's a woman named Margarita Lake, who is basically the Donaldina Cameron of the Methodist Church, and Margarita Lake basically confirmed this lie. So it's basically the Chinese using the system, finding ways around the system, and using it to their advantage. In 1922, the family went back, and this is one of her sons. He took a bride. They actually had a marriage in Hong Kong, but it was a sham marriage, unfortunately, because this young woman came over and she ended up being a child servant. Now, in my family, we have immigration documents that I found at the archives that actually precede all of this. And remember, we only have these documents because of the Exclusion Act. This is my great-grandfather, 1907. No one had ever seen this. He has a Q that's behind his head. You can't see it. And these are his landing papers from August 7th, 1907. So we owe that discrimination, those anti-Chinese policies, to the fact that we have these documents today. By 1916, he's doing much better, and he wants to bring over his wife and his daughter. Now, he has to be a merchant to do that, right? Well, he created his own loophole by basically claiming to be a merchant, finding a family friend who allowed him to, on paper, have a stake in their business in Stockton where they made lap chong. And not only did they allow him to do that, but he got white policemen and other officers to come in and vouch for him. So the Chinese were quite wily, they're crafty, and they found ways around this. And as I said, they created their own loopholes. But this is what she looked like when she was being detained. It's a mugshot, essentially, of my grandmother who was sitting on that bench, and this was the daughter that he was trying to bring over at the same time. One of the things I like to do when I'm doing research on any topic, including Angel Island, is to go back and to try to find documents, source documents, or at least documents that were timely. And one of the things you can do is to find newspaper articles on newspapers.com. So I went in there and I typed in Angel Island between 1910 and 1940. And surprisingly, in California at least, there are only 20 articles. But the ones I found, some of them are really compelling if you look at the language and the attitudes and what the Chinese were doing. So this is only a couple months after Angel Island was started. And the title, as you've seen, says Chinese Wind Fight, Bureau Will Move. Taft fearing general boycott of our goods cuts out Angel Island Station. The immigration office is here. Asiatics claim Bay quarters were gross discrimination against their countrymen. And they basically protested. The Chinese were not passive about this at all. They protested, they had threats, they said they were going to boycott all of the goods, and they found, interestingly, that the steamers, the Pacific Mail Steamship Line, for the past few weeks were empty. No Chinese were getting on the boat, and this obviously is an economic problem for the steamship lines. So the steamship line actually got in line and added their voice to the protest against the anti-Chinese legislation. One of the things that's interesting is that as a last resort, the merchant class of Chinese 4 days ago sent back Luk Tin Eli. Now, you know who he is. He's the person who was the architect of rebuilding Chinatown after the earthquake. And they also sent a representative as a 6 companies, and they sent a second person called Ng Poon Chu. Now, you may not know Ng Poon Chu, but he's actually someone who's in 3 coins. He became an important Chinese-American activist and actually the publisher of the very first Chinese language newspaper outside of China. So how is he connected? Well, he's connected because that's his wife. That's Chun Fu, who is also known as Spring Blossom. And she became the light of the whole home. She married him in 1892. They had 1,200 people come to the wedding. But the point is that all of these people, all of these lives are connected, and 3 coins sort of gives you an opening, an introduction to the lives of these Chinese women in the 1880s. The next article is just a few months later in September of 1910, and it says, Angel Island muddle is to be considered. Petition of Exclusion League asking North's removal. And what that happened, interestingly, was that they had 4 investigators, immigrant at the Angel Island. They were very good at finding the Chinese who shouldn't be allowed to land. But because there were almost no Chinese, who came through after the Angel Island was opened, they were sent elsewhere to work. Well, the Chinese heard about this, and there was a flood of Chinese who were then aware of the fact that they could now get in. So the Chinese were, again, looking for a loophole, looking for an easy way in, and finding ways to circumvent this system. It says down here at the end, meanwhile, the force at Angel Island is struggling with a mass of credentials submitted by the yellow immigrants who are waiting serenely for the lifting of the bars, which they were told can now be moved without difficulty. So they weren't passive, they were active, and they were looking for ways around it and ways to work through this. The next article is, I believe, from 1918, and it says, San Francisco Chinatown, panic is stricken. Probe of stolen Angel Island records stirs fear. And what has happened is that there are thousands, hundreds or thousands of these records from Angel Island. For each of these women who were allowed to come in, they were basically taken off the island, copied, and then sold to the Chinese. Many of these records did not have a photograph, so anyone could use them once they had this and bring other women in illegally. And even the ones that did have photographs, it was very simple, simply to choose and select and to change that photograph. So again, the Chinese are being wily, they're looking for ways around this, and they're using the system to their own advantage. In December of 1918, the first year, Angel Island is termed a grass nest. There was lots of illegal activity that was going on. This last article I have is from 1937. It says, U.S. may quit Angel Island. And this is, as you know, three years before Angel Island was terminated. But one of the things that's interesting here is that they said in the steel vault, the only fireproof part of the station, are more than 1 million records collected since 1851. These vaults contain the passenger and crew list of every foreign vessel that has entered the port of San Francisco and the records of the aliens since the Exclusion Act of 1882. And I don't know that we have all of those still, but certainly those are the records which are just an absolute gold mine for those of us interested. The final arrow here points to something that Virginia beautifully pointed out, and they're saying, according to the commissioner, of every Chinese child who sought admission had actually been entitled to it, every Chinese wife of a citizen in the United States would have to have more than 200 children. I think Virginia showed a much bigger number, but it shows that even they, at that time, were aware that a lot of Chinese came in as paper sons and paper daughters. After that, in 1941, after the Chinese left, it was then being used, Angel Island was, to house prisoners of war, at least Nazi seamen. So I think they sort of saw the Chinese at that point as not much different than these enemies of the United States. Now, ultimately, Angel Island is a story of people. It's a story of human hardship, but it's also the story of the Chinese who learned how to live with, how to exploit, and how to circumvent these unfair, illegal, and immoral anti-Chinese legislation, which really continues to this very day. And I think that's a discussion which hopefully we can look at more fully. Thanks. Bob, back to you.